Dawn crept over the city as though it too feared being seen. The first light brushed the chimneys and slate roofs with a pale, uncertain glow revealing a world already awake with judgment.
Carriage wheels murmured along wet cobblestones, and church bells tolled with solemn restraint, marking not only the hour but the order of a society that never forgot its hierarchies. In this city, reputations were made and broken before breakfast, and mercy was considered a private weakness rather than a public virtue. She stood at the edge of the servants' hall with her hands folded neatly before her, gloves mended too many times to count. There was nothing careless in her bearing. Even now, as whispers moved around her like a draft through ill-fitted windows, she held herself with the quiet discipline of someone raised to believe that dignity was not a reward, but a duty. Her name, spoken softly by her late mother, had once belonged to a gentler life. Now it was used sparingly, as if to remember it too clearly might invite ridicule. The accusation was delivered politely, which somehow made it sharper. A broken porcelain dish lay on the long table between them, its fracture thin and deliberate, as though it had been waiting for this moment. No one claimed to have seen her drop it. No one needed to. The housekeeper's voice carried the practiced calm of authority untroubled by doubt. Carelessness, she said. A pattern, she implied. In the servants' hall, silence became consensus. Eyes lowered, mouths pressed thin, and the young woman understood that her defense would matter less than her position. She answered as she had been taught, evenly, respectfully, without protest. To argue would suggest ambition. To plead would suggest guilt. When she inclined her head, accepting the judgment without visible distress, a murmur passed through the room, not of sympathy but of satisfaction. There was comfort in seeing someone else diminished. It reminded the rest that they still belonged. Dismissal followed swiftly, cloaked in benevolence. She was told she might consider herself fortunate to be reassigned rather than sent away entirely. Gratitude was expected. She thanked them. Only when she turned to leave did her fingers tighten briefly, betraying the cost of her restraint. From the far end of the hall, a woman watched who did not belong there by rights. Her dress was plain, the fabric serviceable rather than fine, her hair coiled beneath a modest cap. She carried herself as servants were expected to, quiet, efficient, unobtrusive, yet her gaze lingered with an attentiveness that suggested habit rather than curiosity. Where others saw a convenient culprit, she saw a young woman absorbing humiliation without bitterness, and that distinction held her still. This older maid had arrived at the household only weeks before, introduced with minimal ceremony and fewer questions. She performed her duties well enough to avoid notice, though there was something in her manner that unsettled those who looked too closely. Her hands were steady, her speech measured, her silences deliberate. She had known palaces and councils, though no one here would have believed it. She had worn crowns heavy with expectation and learned, long ago, that power revealed too easily lost its edge. As the accused young woman passed her, eyes lowered, the older maid observed the careful way she moved, as though each step were an act of penance. She noted the absence of resentment, the refusal to harden. These were qualities that could not be taught, only tested, and the queen, disguised now in wool and humility, had come to this place precisely to find them. The young woman's new quarters were smaller, colder, tucked near the eastern wing where drafts were common and visitors rare. She unpacked in silence, folding her few belongings with meticulous care. Each object bore the memory of a life once promised and never delivered. A ribbon too fine for her current station, a book with a cracked spine, a letter kept not for comfort but for proof that she had once been loved without condition. She sat on the narrow bed and allowed herself a single, steady breath before rising again. There was work to be done. Grief, like pride, was best kept private. By afternoon, the house resumed its rhythm, polished and unyielding. It was then that she first glimpsed him, though she would not understand the significance of the moment until much later. The corridor was narrow, the light filtered through tall windows, and she had been sent to deliver freshly laundered linens. He appeared without warning, tall and unmistakably out of place among servants, his presence altering the air around him. The prince had returned earlier than expected, and the household seemed to hold its breath. He did not look at her at first, distracted by thought or burdened by concerns that no one dared name. When he did, it was with brief surprise, as though noticing a detail overlooked in a familiar painting. Their eyes met for an instant, no longer, and in that exchange there was nothing improper, yet everything unsettled. He inclined his head, a gesture so small it might have been imagined, and moved on without a word. She stood frozen long enough to feel foolish, then chastised herself for the indulgence. Princes did not notice women like her. If he had, it was accidental, without meaning. Still, something in his expression lingered with her through the afternoon. Not desire but recognition, as though he had seen not a servant but a person. The queen observed this encounter from a distance, her expression unreadable. She had raised her son to value restraint, to wear his rank as armor against impulse, yet she had also feared what such discipline might cost him. Watching him now, unaware of the scrutiny upon him, she wondered whether fate had grown impatient with her caution. That evening, as the house settled into its quieter hours, a shawl appeared folded at the foot of the young woman's bed. It was plain, but warm and unmistakably new. No note accompanied it, no claim of ownership or instruction. She touched it hesitantly, as though it might vanish beneath her fingers. Someone had seen her then. Someone had noticed the cold. She did not know that the gift was the first deliberate kindness extended in a carefully measured design, nor that the woman who placed it there had ruled an empire. She only knew that in a place where judgment had come swiftly and without appeal, mercy had arrived just as silently. As she lay awake that night, listening to the wind press against the windows, the young woman allowed herself a dangerous thought, that perhaps her story had not yet been concluded by other people's voices. Beyond her door, unseen and unacknowledged, the queen moved through the shadows of her own household, satisfied that the first trial had revealed exactly what she had hoped, and that the quiet battle for her son's future had begun.
The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt deliberate rather than accidental. The eastern wing, once ignored, became the axis of her labor, and she learned its quiet patterns as one learned the breathing of a child.
The floors there held the chill of stone even at midday, and the windows looked out upon gardens trimmed with excessive care, as though nature itself had been instructed to behave. It was work suited to solitude, and solitude, she told herself, was preferable to scrutiny. Yet scrutiny found her all the same. It arrived not as accusation, but as observation, measured, patient, and exacting. The older maid appeared often in those corridors, always with purpose, always at moments that felt coincidental until coincidence lost its innocence. She asked few questions and gave no unnecessary instruction, but her eyes followed everything. How the young woman folded linens with reverence rather than haste, how she corrected small errors without complaint, how she spoke to no one of her earlier disgrace. If bitterness existed in her, it remained unvoiced. One morning, while dusting a cabinet rarely opened, the young woman discovered a silver brooch resting on the shelf, half hidden beneath a ledger. It was finely worked, unmistakably valuable, and wholly out of place. She stood very still, aware that such discoveries altered lives. To keep it would be ruin. To report it might invite suspicion. She carried it directly to the housekeeper's office, her hands steady despite the weight of implication. The brooch was received with surprise and no small measure of disappointment, as though an opportunity had quietly closed. By evening, word of the incident had spread, reshaped by retelling into something like praise. The queen noted this with approval. Virtue, she had learned, revealed itself not in grand gestures but in moments where no witness was expected. That night, a book appeared where the shawl had been placed days before, a volume of essays, its margins worn by previous contemplation. The selection was not accidental. It spoke of duty balanced by conscience, of loyalty tempered by judgment. The young woman read by candlelight until her eyes ached, unaware that the text had once belonged to the very woman now watching her from the shadows. Her second encounter with the prince came in the garden, where late roses clung stubbornly to their color. She had been sent to clear fallen leaves from the gravel paths, an assignment chosen perhaps for its invisibility. He approached slowly, as though reluctant to intrude upon the quiet. This time he spoke first, his tone formal yet careful, asking whether the work had been assigned correctly. She answered with the respect his rank demanded, but there was no tremor in her voice, no exaggerated deference. He thanked her, then hesitated as if something remained unsaid. The moment stretched, fragile and unsanctioned. When he finally turned away, it was with a glance that suggested not dismissal but restraint. The queen, observing from a nearby window, felt a tightening in her chest that surprised her. She recognized the look. It was the expression of a man raised to deny himself, discovering too late that denial did not extinguish desire. It merely sharpened it. Whispers followed swiftly. Servants noticed where attention lingered, and attention, once noticed, was rarely forgiven. The young woman's reassignment, once seen as quiet exile, began to look suspiciously like favor. Her earlier disgrace resurfaced, embroidered now with implication. It was suggested that humility was a performance, that virtue could be cultivated as currency. She continued her work as before, refusing either defense or explanation, but isolation closed around her like a narrowing corridor. The queen tested her again. A purse heavy with coins was left conspicuously unattended, its presence unmistakable. The young woman returned it within the hour, declining even the modest reward offered. Later, when pressed gently about her intentions, she replied with calm simplicity that she had no use for what was not hers. The answer pleased the queen more than praise ever could. She had spent a lifetime among those who equated possession with worth. Here was someone who understood the difference. The prince felt the change in atmosphere long before it reached him in words. When it did, it arrived softened by caution and delivered with false concern. He listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, though his hand tightened briefly against the arm of his chair. He asked for evidence and received conjecture. He dismissed the matter with courtesy, yet the doubt lingered, not of her character but of his own position. He understood, with sudden clarity, how little freedom his rank afforded him, and how quickly admiration could become accusation. That evening, rain pressed against the windows, and the household retreated inward. The young woman was summoned unexpectedly to a sitting room rarely used, its fire lit against the damp. The older maid waited there alone, her posture relaxed but her gaze intent. She spoke not of rumors or warnings, but of choice. She asked whether the young woman wished to remain in service, whether she found dignity in her labor or merely endurance. The question was offered without judgment, yet it carried weight. The young woman answered honestly, admitting fatigue but not regret. Service, she said, was not the wound. Contempt was. She would endure the former as long as she was spared the latter. The queen inclined her head, acknowledging a truth she herself had learned too late. When the young woman was dismissed, another small gift awaited her. Gloves, well made and unadorned, suitable for winter. They fit perfectly. By week's end, the whispers sharpened into something more dangerous. A misplaced glance, a misremembered instruction, these became proof of intention. The young woman sensed the shift and prepared herself accordingly, paring her belongings further, rehearsing departure without bitterness. She would leave as she had arrived, quietly, with no appeal to mercy that had not been freely given. Unseen by her, the queen considered the board she had set and the pieces now in motion. The test had grown larger than she intended, touching not only the young woman's integrity but her son's resolve. Intervention loomed, though not yet. There remained one measure untested: whether truth could withstand public doubt. As the rain eased and the house settled into uneasy sleep, the prince stood alone at a window overlooking the gardens. He thought of the way she carried herself, of the steadiness that refused both flattery and fear. For the first time, he questioned whether silence, long mistaken for wisdom, might instead be complicity. In the eastern wing, the young woman extinguished her candle and lay awake, aware that whatever came next would demand more than patience. Between them, unseen and calculating, the queen prepared the next move, certain now that the quiet virtues she sought were worth the risk of revelation.
Morning arrived without comfort. The air carried a brittle stillness, as though the house itself had grown weary of its own whispers. By the time the bells marked the hour, the young woman had already folded her belongings into a single trunk, leaving nothing behind that might suggest attachment. Each item was handled with care, not because it was precious, but because it had shared her adherence. She moved quietly, aware that departure required no audience, only resolve.
The summons reached her just as she closed the lid. It was delivered without ceremony, yet its timing unsettled her. She followed the messenger through corridors she had learned too well, her steps measured, her thoughts disciplined against hope. The room she was led into was modestly appointed but warmed by firelight, the curtains drawn against the pale sky. It was a place designed for conversation rather than command, and that distinction alone signaled something irretrievable. The prince stood near the window, his back turned, one hand resting against the frame as though grounding himself. When he spoke her name, it was with care, each syllable weighed. He did not ask her to explain herself at once. Instead, he asked whether she intended to leave. The question carried no accusation, only concern restrained by habit. She answered truthfully that she had prepared to do so, believing it best for the household. He turned then, fully, and the distance between them felt suddenly inadequate. He studied her as one studies a painting long familiar but newly illuminated. There was weariness in her eyes, but also a composure that refused surrender. He asked about the rumors, not as charges, but as burdens that had been placed before him. She listened without interruption, absorbing the weight of words that had already cost her more than they ever would him. When she spoke, it was not in her defense, but in clarity. She denied nothing that could be proven because nothing could. She acknowledged the danger of appearances, admitting that proximity to power often invited misinterpretation. What she refused was indignation. She spoke of her conduct, of the care she took to remain invisible, of her desire only to serve with dignity until service was no longer offered. Her voice never rose, yet it held the room. He listened, and something in him shifted. He had been trained to interrogate motives, to suspect eloquence, to mistake silence for compliance. Here was neither. Her restraint unsettled him more than passion ever could. When she finished, she did not wait for judgment. She lowered her gaze slightly, not in submission, but in courtesy, as though the conversation itself were a privilege she had no right to demand. The queen observed from the adjoining chamber, the door ajar just enough to admit sound. She had intended to wait longer, to see whether truth might find its own defense. Yet listening now, she recognized the familiar danger of delay. Integrity could be worn thin by patience. She stepped forward deliberately, allowing her presence to be felt before her words. The prince turned, startled, and in that instant she shed the final layer of disguise. She did not announce herself with titles. She simply met her son's eyes and let recognition do its work. The effect was immediate and profound. He straightened, instinctively deferential, yet she raised a hand to still him. Her gaze moved to the young woman, who stood frozen, comprehension dawning slowly, painfully. The queen regarded her not as subject, but as equal in this moment of exposure. She spoke of observation and purpose, of tests designed not to entrap but to reveal. She admitted, without apology, that she had come seeking what the court had failed to provide, a woman whose worth was not rehearsed for display. She told of the shawl, the book, the moments arranged to tempt or betray. None had been taken. The young woman listened, her expression composed despite the revelation's magnitude. When the queen finished, silence followed, dense with implication. It was the young woman who spoke first. She expressed neither gratitude nor fear, but understanding. She said only that she had acted as she must, regardless of who watched. If that pleased Her Majesty, she was honored. If not, she would depart without protest. The Queen inclined her head, acknowledging a courage that required no audience. In that moment a bond formed, not of allegiance, but of mutual recognition. The prince found his voice with difficulty. He spoke of duty and consequence, of the impossibility of private choice within public life. Yet beneath the measured phrasing lay urgency. He confessed, indirectly, the admiration he had resisted, the questions he had silenced. The Queen listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she did not answer him at once. Instead, she addressed the young woman, offering her a choice. She might leave now, with protection and provision, her name restored quietly, her future secured beyond the reach of gossip. Or she might stay, not as servant, but as guest, and allow truth to face scrutiny openly. The decision was hers alone. The offer was not framed as generosity, but as respect. The room seemed to contract around the choice. The young woman felt the weight of it settle in her chest, heavy but clarifying. She thought of the years spent yielding ground, of dignity preserved only in retreat. She lifted her gaze and answered with calm resolve that she would stay, not for advancement, nor for favor, but because she would not allow falsehood to dictate her departure. If judgment came, she would meet it standing. The Queen's approval was subtle but unmistakable. She dismissed the young woman gently, promising that arrangements would be made. When the door closed, mother and son stood alone. The Queen spoke then of legacy, of the cost of caution mistaken for wisdom. She reminded him that silence could preserve peace, but rarely justice. He listened, the words settling deeper than command ever could. That night, the household buzzed with restrained anticipation. An announcement circulated of a forthcoming gathering, formal yet unexpected. Invitations were extended beyond custom, and preparations began with unusual haste. In her quiet room, the young woman sat beside her packed trunk, unsure whether to unpack or abandon it entirely. She felt neither triumph nor fear, only a steady awareness that the path ahead would no longer permit anonymity. Elsewhere, the prince stood at his desk, drafting and redrafting a letter he did not yet intend to send. Each version fell short of the truth he struggled to name. He understood now that what he faced was not merely a choice of affection, but of courage. Across the house, the Queen moved with purpose renewed, satisfied that the turning point had been reached. The quiet trials were ending. What followed would demand witness, and with it consequence. The evening arrived with a splendor that felt almost defiant. Light spilled from the high windows of the great hall, catching on crystal and gilt, turning every surface into a quiet proclamation of permanence. Chandeliers blazed overhead, their reflections multiplying in polished floors until the room seemed to glow from within. Courtiers gathered in careful clusters, silk and velvet arranged with studied ease, voices pitched low with anticipation. Something unusual had been promised, though no one could quite say what it was. She entered without announcement, escorted not by command but by invitation. The gown she wore was elegant without excess, its lines clean, its color restrained, chosen not to dazzle but to endure scrutiny. She walked with the same composure that had carried her through corridors of judgment, yet now each step echoed differently. Eyes followed her, curiosity sharpening into surprise, surprise into speculation. Whispers stirred like a current beneath still water, but she did not flinch. Dignity, once learned, did not abandon her when circumstances changed. At the far end of the hall, the Queen stood beside her son, her presence commanding without display. She wore the crown tonight, not as ornament but as declaration. When the music softened and conversation faltered, she stepped forward, and the room obeyed her silence. Her voice, when she spoke, was measured and clear, carrying easily across the space. She spoke first of service, of loyalty misunderstood, of the danger of mistaking refinement for virtue. She reminded them that courts were skilled at rehearsing appearances, less so at recognizing truth when it arrived unadorned. Then she spoke of observation, of time spent unseen among them, of lessons learned not from ceremony but from conduct. Each word settled with deliberate weight. Faces paled as comprehension spread, as recent weeks were reconsidered through a harsher lens. When she turned to the young woman, the gesture was neither theatrical nor indulgent. She named her with care, restoring publicly what had been quietly eroded. She spoke of integrity proven without witness, of restraint mistaken for weakness, of courage exercised in silence. There was no defense offered on her behalf, because none was needed. Truth, once spoken plainly, required no ornament. The prince moved then, stepping forward with a resolve that silenced the last murmur. His voice was steady, though emotion threaded it unmistakably. He spoke not of romance, nor of impulse, but of recognition. He admitted, without shame, that he had been taught to value composure above conviction, caution above justice. He confessed that in doing so, he had nearly allowed silence to become complicity. He addressed the young woman directly, his words chosen with care that could not conceal their significance. He said that he had seen her endure what would have embittered many, that he had observed a strength rooted not in ambition but in principle. He declared that such character was not incidental to leadership, but essential to it. In choosing to speak now, he acknowledged the cost of delay and accepted it without reservation. The room held its breath. This was not defiance, but something more unsettling, alignment between authority and conscience. The queen watched her son with an expression that softened only briefly, pride tempered by relief. She had hoped for this moment without daring to expect it. The young woman listened, her expression composed, though the gravity of the moment pressed against her chest. When invited to respond, she did so with the same restraint that had defined her throughout. She spoke of gratitude without supplication, of respect without surrender. She said that dignity, once compromised, was difficult to reclaim, and that she would accept no future built upon denial of her past. Whatever path lay ahead, it must be chosen openly, or not at all. The prince inclined his head, accepting the condition without hesitation. In that gesture, simple yet irrevocable, the court understood that a line had been crossed and redrawn. The queen closed the moment with quiet authority, declaring the matter settled. Music resumed, though its sound changed, as though even the instruments sensed the shift. Later, as the gathering dissolved into subdued conversation, the young woman found herself alone briefly on the terrace. The night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain and late blossoms. She rested her hands against the stone balustrade, grounding herself in the solidity of the moment. Footsteps approached, unhurried and familiar. The prince joined her without ceremony. They stood side by side, not touching, yet aware of the shared space between them. He spoke softly, acknowledging the courage it had taken to remain when leaving would have been easier. She replied that courage was rarely recognized in the moment of its exercise, only afterward, when it could no longer be withdrawn. They did not speak of the future in detail. Such matters, both understood, would require patience equal to what had already been endured. Instead, they spoke of smaller things: the garden in early morning, the comfort of routine, the relief of being seen without distortion. In these exchanges, something steadier than passion took root, a trust built from tested ground. As the night deepened, the queen watched from within, satisfied not by triumph but by balance restored. She knew the court would adjust, as courts always did, reshaping memory to suit convenience. Yet she also knew that something essential had been altered. A precedent had been set, not by decree, but by example. When the carriage later carried the young woman back to her quarters, the city lay quiet beneath the stars. She felt neither elation nor fear, only a calm certainty that her life, once directed by avoidance, now moved toward intention. The road ahead remained uncertain, but it would be walked openly, with no need to diminish herself to survive it. Behind her, the palace lights dimmed one by one, settling into rest. Ahead, the dawn waited, patient and impartial, ready to reveal what endurance had earned. The story, though resolved in its first great test, had not ended. It had merely claimed its voice, prepared now to be told in full.